So how would Luther have understood the sort of the metaphysics of that, or the broad spiritual parameters of what it means for Christ to dwell in the soul of the believer?
Yeah, the question of metaphysics with Luther is always difficult because I think it's very clear that Luther was not a metaphysician. He was never pretending to be. Though, with that being said, especially in Luther's early writings, when he deals with scholastic philosophy, he seems to know it pretty well. I
Yeah,
think though those weren't his primary concerns in his writing, I think he did have a pretty good grasp on philosophy,
yeah,
more than he's often given credit for. But you have to look at Luther's own influences, I think, to his own spiritual influence, the people that he himself cites as helping him to form his perspective on the Christian life as a whole, and justification in particular. And if you look at the authors that he tends to cite the most, you've got a few of them. Saint Augustine, of course, is the most well known. He was an Augustinian friar, and Luther often quoted Augustine. Everybody knows that. But beyond Augustine, you have John Tauler, the German mystical preacher that was highly influential on Luther. Luther cited him very frequently, and we actually have the annotated volumes of Tauler that Luther himself had, and we can see the notes that he took on Tauler. And something that Luther often did in his writings, or when he's reading other writings, he'd look at theological claims and he'd write yes or no in the margins to say if he agreed with it or not. And it's been noted that when he's writing on Tauler, it's pretty much entirely yes that he writes. He's
yeah.
not disagreeing significantly with Tauler. So John Tauler was a German mystic, a very practical and a very Neoplatonic kind of thinker. You see Bernard of Clairvaux is another significant influence on Luther, and Luther called him Pater Bernardus, right, Father Bernard, because he saw Bernard kind of as his spiritual father, though obviously he didn't know him
Yeah.
personally, as they were divided by a number of years, but theologically and spiritually, he always looked up to Bernard as a significant figure. And I think there's no question of the mystical nature of Bernard's writings. And his work on loving God is a classic that I've continually revisited, as well as his sermons on the Song of Songs, and I think that's really where Luther draws this common bridal imagery that he uses, this imagery of the believer as the bride and Christ as the bridegroom, and there's this intimacy, I think, that stands there. So you've got Bernard, and then you have the anonymous work that Luther himself calls the Theologia Germanica, right? The German theology that he republishes and popularizes. And we don't know exactly who wrote the German theology, probably a 14th century work of some kind that is likely written by a student of Tauler. But it is a really weird book. It's one that our publishing house republishes. We republish some Tauler as well to kind of try to get some of those influences on Luther himself to get more widely read, because I think they're essential for understanding Luther. When you look at the German theology, I have noted that there's a very significant difference between how Luther looks at that text and how Calvin looks at that text. Calvin refers to that book as spiritual poison at one point. And Luther says at one point that there is nothing that we have taught that's not found in that book.
Hmm.
And so that shows you that they have a bit of a different attitude. There's something in that particular text that makes Luther praise it and Calvin hate it. So what is
Yeah.
that? And I
Yeah.
would say that it is that kind of Neoplatonic type of mystical background that Luther draws on and that Luther loves, that Calvin is very skeptical of. So I do think that Luther is really best understood as a mystical theologian. I don't think that Luther is an anti-metaphysical theologian. Some people do take him that way. Some people take him as a more nominalist theologian. I don't personally think that's accurate. I think that metaphysics is not his primary concern, but if you could nail down a metaphysic, I would say that Luther largely relies on a Neoplatonic one. And I think there's evidence of that in the Heidelberg Disputation, for example, so the Heidelberg Disputation is one of Luther's early disputations, 1518. It's often cited today. There are a number of works since the kind of mid 20th century that have been written on that. And it's a series of two sets of theses. And the first set of theses are the theological theses, and the second are the philosophical ones. Well, the theological ones are the ones that everybody talks about. Those are also the only ones translated into English. A friend of mine, Eric Phillips, translated the others, the philosophical theses. I don't know when the heck they're actually being published. He translated them like 5 years ago, but so one of these days it'll be out. But when you read the philosophical theses, Luther explains why it is that he's not a fan of Thomas Aquinas, right? And I think that's everybody kind of knows that. And their question as to whether he really understands Thomas or not. But regardless, he's very critical of Aristotle. But if you read the philosophical theses, Luther seems to make it pretty clear that the reason he doesn't like Aristotle is that Aristotle was not enough of a realist. And Luther seems to be very committed to a much more Platonic approach. And in that way, probably has more in common with the Eastern fathers than, the Western medieval scholastics.